So here we are at the mountain. It's a hot day. I got the air conditioning on. That's why you hear that Camaro fan winding up. Let's take a look at this thing. We got a lot of options on this. Steel bumper, winch. Now guys, sink your winch, please. I think you can see that when the winch is not sunk, the air is going to hit this at speed and just go right over the hood. So sink that winch if you can. We got lights all over here. Aftermarket fenders, we got a roof rack, lights all over here. Got the typical tire carrier, high lift jack, steel bumper. This door took a shot at some time. Doesn't work anymore. So when you do your build, check all this stuff out beforehand. Now we're lucky here because this roof rack can unbolt from the chassis. If this roof rack were welded on, then it would be more effort. In fact, these rock rails are welded on and we got to work around that. Sometimes when we work on these, when they have cages welded in, we have to do the swap from the front. When we do the swap from the front, we got to remove all this. The bumper, the grill, the core support, headlights, wiring, harnesses. It's actually a lot more work. We can get the body off one of these in about 40 minutes, where it takes a guy a half a day to get the whole front end off. So if you don't have a lift, then you're stuck with doing it through the front, which is doable. It just takes more time and diligence. Hey guys, here we are out near Red Rock in a new two-door build. This has a 6-liter L96. We've talked about the L96 many times. We're not going to say a whole lot about it. I'd rather talk about swap process. Now I'd like to say that every vehicle we do is new and has no modifications, and every engine we do is new, but that's just not the reality of it. And most of you guys doing your own swaps probably aren't using new crate engines, new crate transmissions, and probably not a new JK. So we basically see kinds of what I call interferences. One are add-ons, air compressors, skid plates, rock rails, all the things that guys buy out of these catalogs, rock cameras, rock light, grill insert. You know, it's pretty hot out here in Vegas. It's been averaging over 100 and sometimes over 110. Things like grill inserts, not sinking your winch, putting lights in front of the grill, all restrict the amount of airflow going into the grill. And these are things that we have to look at during the swap. So we're not going to call it swap problems. We're just going to call it concerns during the swap. So one thing is add-on stuff. Two is problems with the Jeep. However your Jeep is going into the swap is how it's going to basically be coming out of the swap. What I mean by that is if you have an issue with your ABS or your steering or your suspension, it's going to be the same after the swap. Now these LSs weigh pretty similar, especially the all aluminum engines, to the stock V6. So vehicle dynamics are not really changed. You are adding a lot of horsepower, so things like torque steer, bump steer, brake steer can be exaggerated because now we have a lot more horsepower that will lift the front end up when you launch. During the swap, when the vehicle first comes in, we take a good look at it. We look at all the interferences. And some of these Jeeps are highly optioned. Like I said, dual air compressors, weld-on rock rails, full skid plates, S-pods, sometimes dual S-pods, cameras all the way around, lights all the way around, roof racks. Do your diligence before you start the swap. On some swaps, we actually spend more time with the interferences than we do with the swap. The vehicle I'm driving now has quite a history. The customer told me that it had been salvaged 3 different times. I think a couple of times for accident, maybe one for water, I'm not sure. But basically when we got it, we had some lights on the dash and we definitely had a lot of issues. This was also a manual transmission that we converted to an automatic. He's got a Tuffy console in it, one of those metal consoles, so again there's another interference. Even though it's a manual transmission JK, you can see that we have full control of the Prindle on the dash and all the lights are out. And that took probably longer than the swap itself. I think the customer said he spent something close to $6,000 tracing down CAN issues. One of the issues being the sway bar connector. And I always wanted to talk about that in one of my videos because I've seen a lot of issues with this. But the sway bar connector on the Rubicons has a module and it's on the CAN network. That module is down there in the mud and the dirt and the heat and the water. If it shorts out the CAN network, you can have all sorts of issues. Your dashboard can go crazy. It can even cause the engine to stall. Well, this guy had a problem with that, and apparently it was fixed after a lot of money. And he had some other issues. Now, whoever owned the Jeep previous to this customer basically took all the carpeting out and spray lined everything, including all the wires, grounds, wiring harnesses. So that just makes the job tougher because when you're trying to diagnose, you have no wire color, everything is black, and then when you do find the wire you want to get to, you basically got to scrape all the undercoat off just to get to it to diagnose it. So what we found after the swap was the vehicle ran great, but we had CAN corruption. First issue this guy had was an internal short in the ABS module. I remember years ago when I was in general automotive repair, when the Chrysler L cars came out, crazy things would happen. Like the coolant temp gauge wouldn't work because you had a bad ABS module. And the reality is, because the CAN network communicates from module to module, that's the whole object, is to reduce wiring. So instead of having redundant wiring, like in the old days, we actually ran 2 coolant temp sensors. I'm not talking about our swap, I'm talking about manufacturers. They would run one for the instrument cluster and one for the computer. Well, the government said, hey, why don't we go to a controller area network? We just run one sensor and then network the modules together, and they can then share all the information. And that works great. But the problem is, if there is a problem, it can share that problem. So you see crazy things like an ABS module shorting out, causing the vehicle not to crank. And that actually happened in this vehicle. The second problem we had, I think the customer was told, was very difficult to repair, and it was. We had an airbag light on, and the code it has had to do with losing communication with the occupant classification module. The occupant classification module is under the seat in this JK, in the passenger side. He has a lockbox there where it was, so it was relocated. But the problem wasn't where it was relocated. Everything was spray lined, so it was difficult to see what we were doing. But we determined that the signals were not getting through to the occupant classification module. So we traced the wires between the TIPM and the module, and sure enough, the problem was way up under the dash, up behind the heater core. We ended up stringing a couple of new wires for the affected circuits. We got the classification module back on the network. It's communicating now. Occupant restraint system, the airbag system, is working as intended. As you can see, there's no light. But here's my point. When you do a build in an earlier JK, or even a newer JK that's had issues, has been salvaged, be careful. I had a couple of customers buy salvaged JKs from the New Orleans flood. Now in some cases you're okay, but one customer found most of the modules in the system were fried. The fuel tank was full of water, the fuel pump was bad, tip had been underwater, and it just turned out that it would have been better to buy another JK. Now if it's lightly damaged and all that happened was maybe the engine hydrolock, yeah, go for it. But sometimes saving a few dollars on a salvaged JK isn't worth it. The other thing that I really shy away from is burned JK. Early in the JK production, Chrysler put their wonderful transmission cooler in the bottom of the AC condenser. As you know, the bottom of the AC condenser is behind the bumper, which basically means the transmission wasn't getting cooled very well. Chrysler's solution in about 2008-2009 was to add a hot oil and a dinger when the transmission would overheat to tell you to stop. I know a lot of customers that were going up mountain grades, even going to Mount Charleston, and getting the hot oil and the dinger, and they had to stop. Problem if you kept going, or if you didn't have the update done and you didn't know your transmission was overheating, is the transmission oil would get really hot, it would expand, and it would push out the dipstick tube right onto the exhaust manifold. So when you have vaporized transmission fluid and all that heat, poof, it would just light off, and a lot of JKs burned because of that. So what we had was a lot of JKs that were burned around the windshield area, and depending on how bad that fire was, we determined if that JK was worth salvaging. I had one customer in North Dakota that bought a burned JK, and he ended up having to replace all the electronics in the engine compartment, basically. All the wiring harnesses. Yes, he got a lot of stuff out of wrecking yards, but he found that some of the stuff wasn't compatible because Jeep did change the pinout on the wiring harnesses over the years, even with the same engine. So the same 3.8 engine, you could find several different pinouts on the harnesses. He ended up having to change out the TIPM, ABS module, and a bunch of other stuff. I really have a sigh of relief when a JK comes in and it's unmodified. It's an 18, it's a 17. It's never been touched. The engine compartment doesn't have ARB compressors and S-pods and stereo stuff and things all over, because I just know that that's going to add time to the build. Now Jeeps are accessorized, and that's all there is to it. Guys buy Jeeps to personalize and make them what they want. We got some builds going on right now in the house. We're doing LT4s, we're doing LT1s, which in and of itself is a pretty complex swap, but we're also doing axles and suspension and hydraulics and brake upgrades, and when you add it all together, it's just a lot of work. So keep this in mind, because our swap integrates so well with a stock JK, that means we're not ripping out instrument clusters, we're not modifying the CAN network. However your Jeep was operating prior to the swap, suspension-wise, handling, braking system, ESP, is how it's going to be when it comes out of the swap. Now, if you choose to fix things during the swap, like we always do, that's great. In fact, this Jeep was also from New Jersey, or back east, so I had a lot of rust on the frame. It had cables, like the e-brake cables were seized up and rusted. We had to change the e-brake assembly. So there's just all these things that we have to address during the swap on an older Jeep or a Jeep that had issues. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for it. Back in the 70s and 80s, that's what I did, is I used to buy muscle cars, restore them, fix them up, and then either keep them or sell them. I love restoring things. So before you do a swap, whether you're a shop or the individual customer, take a good hard look at the JK. Look at all the interferences that have been added on. Look at all the aftermarket stuff that's been added on. Take that into account time-wise. And then also look at what doesn't work. Test drive the Jeep. Check air conditioning. Check cruise control. Check for death wobble. See if it drives straight. See if it drives like a crab. Hit the brakes. Make sure there's no torque steer or bump steer. Because however it is before the swap is how it's going to be after the swap. And maybe worse, because when you double the horsepower, it's going to exaggerate any problems that exist. It's funny, you just never know how these things work out. Even though this Jeep was challenged, it actually runs excellent. So we're going to hit the mountain with this 6-liter. We got a bunch of LT builds going on, everything from the LT3 5.3 up to the LT4s. I believe we're going to be doing a couple of LT4s in-house. So stay tuned.